Retroactively, the people of the Seattle area would recognize that they fell under siege in August 1992. Fires started breaking out in the region around the city, but they didn't attract a lot of attention at first. Then, week by week throughout August, and then September, and then October, the fires increased in frequency and severity. It got to the point where firefighters believed they could be dealing with multiple fires at the same time any night of the week. The fires were the work of a serial arsonist, but investigators had no leads on a suspect. It would be at least 2 more months before they understood that they were looking for 27-year-old Paul Keller. For years, Keller struggled with inner demons. He had struggled with hyperactivity as a child, and he had a long history of tormenting his 2 younger siblings. As an adult, he battled alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, divorce, and finally, bankruptcy. Paul was working for his father at the family's advertising agency, and he had been on a downward spiral for a year. After Paul's brief marriage failed, his father threw him a lifeline and gave him a steady job at the agency. At first, Paul did well, but then his old struggles reemerged. In July of 1992, his life cratered, and his father gave him an ultimatum: clean up your act or you're fired. Paul couldn't afford to lose his job, so he found an outlet for his anger. In August 1992, Paul Keller started lighting fires in houses that were under construction, office buildings, churches, and shopping malls. In September, he targeted 2 retirement homes, and his fire at 4 Freedoms retirement community claimed 3 lives. Without knowing it in the moment, he had graduated from arson to murder. He would have learned about the murders through the news, but he didn't stop his arson campaign. Investigators knew it was only a matter of time before more people died, especially as Keller started lighting residential homes on fire with people in them. One of those homes was occupied by a woman named Ruth Fox and her roommate. During the arson fires that autumn, Ruth finished her day at work and went home to unwind with a bath. She had just finished and was drying herself off with a towel when she heard a loud crashing sound outside the house. Then there was another crash, and another. To her, it sounded as if someone was breaking windows. Ruth threw on some clothes, left the bathroom, and searched the house. At one point, she opened a door, and to her horror, she was greeted with a wall of flames. Ruth slammed the door and ran to find her roommate. The 2 women instinctively hurried to the front door of the house, but when they opened it, they saw the entire front porch was consumed by flames. For a moment, Ruth and her roommate stood frozen as they watched their exit strategy disintegrate. Then, Ruth snapped out of her trance. She grabbed her roommate's hand and ran back inside. As they rushed through the house, they realized the front was blazing, but the back was still okay. They crashed through the back door and escaped the inferno. Eventually, firefighters put out the fire, but much of the house was destroyed. By November 1992, more and more people like Ruth were watching their homes burn, some with similar narrow escapes. Investigators were desperate. The phantom serial arsonist had gone from targeting empty buildings to targeting full retirement communities and now occupied homes. He was either trying to kill or he didn't care if he did. Investigators would need to pool their resources and then resort to an unorthodox tactic to bring the arsonist to justice. From Black Barrel Media, this is Infamous America. I'm your host, Chris Wimmer, and this season we're telling the story of 2 of the most notorious arsonists in American history, John Orr and Paul Keller. This is Episode 6, Paul Keller, The Specter. Throughout the fall of 1992, local authorities and fire departments were at a loss for words. More than 50 fires had been started in Snohomish, King, Pierce, and Kittitas counties. The fires had caused millions of dollars worth of damage and killed 3 people. and investigators had zero clues with which to identify a suspect. They couldn't confirm it at the time, but Paul Keller simply walked up to something flammable like wood or trash or paper products and lit them on fire using a cigarette lighter. Investigators couldn't find any clues because there were no clues to find. Equally frustrating was the fact that multiple fires happened on the same night in different counties. In the early days of the rampage, local authorities had worked separately on their investigations. But by November 1992, it was obvious that one person, as crazy as it sounded, was responsible for all the fires. So, investigators joined forces. County fire departments, police agencies, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms created the Sno-King Arson Task Force. They named it Sno-King after Snohomish and King counties, the two areas most affected by the fires. Leading the task force were ATF Special Agent Dane Wetzel and Seattle Fire Department Lieutenant Randy Litchfield. With resources pooled, they hoped they could finally bring down the serial arsonist they had now dubbed the Specter. The Sno-King Task Force's initial investigation got off to a slow start, almost as if nothing had changed. As the series of fires continued in late November, investigators compiled the thin strands of knowledge that were available at the time. While some fires did begin in the early evening, the majority were reported in the early morning hours, just before 4 a.m. Any structure was still fair game, but the task force noticed that many of the fires occurred near major highways, such as Highway 99 or Interstate 5. It also became clear that the Specter knew exactly where the various fire departments were located. Based on a given night's series of fires, the task force realized that the Specter would draw out one fire department and then move to the opposite end of town or the county to light another. Investigators were convinced that the Specter was toying with them. The task force established a tip line, and the phones rang off the hook. People described seeing a suspicious-looking man walking between houses just before a fire erupted, or they saw a man running away from a vacant lot just as smoke and flames consumed a nearby building. But the callers seemed to provide so few details about the suspicious man or men that the information did little to lead the task force to a specific person. Then, in December, investigators thought they finally caught their big break. At one of the fires, they discovered a fingerprint on a window panel. When investigators looked closer, they realized it was actually two partial prints. The partial prints were good enough to analyze, and anticipation was high. Unfortunately, when the lab results came back, there wasn't a match in the criminal database. In other words, the Specter most likely did not have a criminal record. But while the fingerprint didn't lead to anything substantial, the task force and the region as a whole did get something of a holiday present that December. As temperatures dropped, so did the number of fires. A few still popped up in December, but the rate fell significantly. The decline was welcome, but it didn't relieve the desperation of the task force. With so little tangible evidence, the task force needed other ways to learn more about the suspect. Co-task force leader Dane Wetzel decided to ask for some help. Like the Pillow Pyro Task Force in LA the previous year, who were searching for the arsonist who would turn out to be John Orr, the Sno-King Task Force turned to the FBI criminal profilers for guidance. In December 1992, ATF agent Dane Wetzel called the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and asked them to create a profile of the serial arsonist. While the FBI studied the case and worked on a profile, the task force received an interesting tip. A woman named Bonnie Spurrier called investigators and claimed she had had a run-in with the possible arsonist. The encounter had happened outside of a bar that had been set on fire. The man was drunk, but in his stupor, he talked about the fires in a concerning way. The task force brought Bonnie in for questioning, and she reiterated her story. She also described seeing the man's car. Unfortunately, because the incident happened back in November, she didn't remember the car's license plate number. As investigators listened to Bonnie's story, they considered trying a seldom-used technique to get her to remember the license plate number. They were going to hypnotize her. Forensic hypnosis is a technique that uses hypnosis to enhance a witness's memory of a crime. The hope is that a hypnosis expert will be able to help walk the witness through the details they may have forgotten due to the passage of time. The technique was popular from the 1950s to the 1980s, but its use decreased significantly by the 1990s. In fact, the current arson investigation would be one of the few times it was used in a major investigation. The task force knew that the use of forensic hypnosis was unorthodox. They also knew that evidence gleaned from the technique wasn't usually admissible in court, and the witness may not be able to testify. But with more than 60 unsolved arson fires since August and no viable suspects, investigators decided to use the technique on Bonnie. Sometime in December, probably the second half of the month, though the exact timeline is fuzzy, a trained forensic hypnotist put Bonnie under hypnosis and began to unlock memories from Bonnie's subconscious. As Bonnie traveled back to her encounter with the man she believed to be the arsonist, new details emerged. She recalled his appearance. He was tall, thin, and white. She remembered that his hair was pushed back, not slicked back, but pushed back. He had a mustache, and he was neatly dressed in an Oxford shirt. She remembered watching him walk to his car. It might have been a blue sedan or something along those lines. Then came the question at the top of the investigators' minds. Could Bonnie recall anything about the license plate? She couldn't remember the entire license plate number, but she believed it started with K4M. After the initial hypnosis, investigators started to search vehicle records with their new reference points, and they wanted Bonnie to sit with a sketch artist to create a drawing of the man in her memory. But in creating the sketch, investigators decided to hypnotize Bonnie once again. Forensic artist John Hines described the process as one of the most unusual of his career, and the only time it happened. But desperate times called for desperate measures. So, under hypnosis, Bonnie repeated the details of the man she had talked to outside the bar, and John Hines drew a sketch. And as the task force finished the process and likely started to feel a sense of momentum for the first time, it received promising news. The FBI had completed its profile. As the holiday season passed and 1993 began, the Sno-King task force started gaining some ground on the Specter. The fact that the arsonist had, for whatever reason, decided to slow down his activity helped law enforcement take some extra time to investigate. From Bonnie Spurrier's memory, they now had a sketch of a possible suspect, a rough description of his car, and a partial license plate number. They also had partial fingerprints for comparison when he was identified. And now they had the FBI's profile of the criminal. In early January 1993, the Behavioral Science Unit said the arsonist was likely a white male in his late 20s to mid-30s. He was described as an internalizer, that is, someone who bottled up emotions until they erupted in destructive behavior. The profile suggested he was angry with society, but lacked the courage for direct confrontation, choosing instead to express his rage through fire. The arsonist also likely had some kind of trauma that triggered the start of his crime spree. They theorized it had something to do with the loss of a loved one, or maybe financial hardship. However, as the arsonist's crimes continued and gained media attention, a sense of validation likely overcame him, and it was now feeding into his desire to start more fires. The profile offered a fairly accurate description of Paul Keller. But as investigators also learned, Keller's case was difficult because of its simplicity, and any analysis was of limited value. The FBI highlighted some unusual details that didn't fit a traditional arsonist. For starters, the fires over the last several months never gained in sophistication. It's fairly common for serial offenders, like killers, bombers, or arsonists, to evolve over time. Their methods change in various ways as they learn to be more efficient in their crimes and in the strategies they use to avoid detection. But as far as investigators could tell, the Specter never changed his methods. The Specter didn't leave a calling card of any kind. He didn't seem to keep trophies from his crimes or stick with the exact types of targets. That was the one thing that had evolved. He had started by burning empty churches and houses that were under construction. Then he moved on to retirement homes and shopping malls. And now he had added occupied homes and neighborhood bars. Virtually any structure was now a target. While the profile provided insight into the suspect, it didn't help pinpoint the identity of the suspect. Meanwhile, new fires throughout January provided little concrete evidence, even when it seemed like the task force caught another break. At one January fire, investigators discovered a footprint in some snow that revealed that the arsonist wore hiking boots that evening. And then a few weeks later, they found urine near one of the fires. But by the time they were able to get a sample to the lab for analysis, it had been diluted by the snow and they couldn't retrieve DNA from it. Again, tiny bits of evidence were accumulating, but they were leading nowhere. The Sno-King arson task force decided to go back to the public for help. They released the sketch and aspects of the FBI's profile. With the combination of the sketch and the personality assessment, investigators hoped someone would put the two together as a match. Two people did. They recognized the combination immediately, and within 24 hours, the task force had a possible name for its suspect. On January 27, 1993, the Sno-King Arson Task Force held a press conference to reveal elements of the FBI's profile and the sketch, but they actually released 3 sketches. One was the description from Bonnie Spurrier, and the other 2 were different images to be used as controls. The idea behind releasing fakes was to avoid or weed out misleading tips. During the press conference, ATF agent Dane Wetzel described the suspect. He has no self-esteem. He may come from a dysfunctional family. There's some indication that he may be mentally ill, such as schizophrenia. However, it may be as simple as a deep-seated emotional problem. He gains a great deal of enthusiasm and thrill from setting these fires. Wetzel's partner, Randy Litchfield, said, "Someone may know this man. Come forward." Ben Keller, Paul Keller's 21-year-old brother, happened to have the news on television that morning. Ben wasn't directly tuning in, but as he glanced at the TV and started paying more attention, he saw Wetzel and Litchfield describe the man they thought could be the serial arsonist. Ben had a sinking feeling that it was his older brother, Paul. The next morning, Ben did his own quick investigation. Ben called his sister Ruth, who still worked at the family's ad agency. It's not clear if he shared his suspicion, but he asked her to check gas receipts on the company's credit card bill. He wanted to see if any of the charges matched dates and locations of fires. Sure enough, Ruth discovered the card was used on November 17, 1992, in Cleome, a small town about an hour and 15 minutes east of Seattle. There was a fire in Cleome that same day. That same morning, while the Keller siblings were discussing scary possibilities, George and Margaret Keller, their parents, were eating breakfast and reading the Everett Herald newspaper. That day's edition discussed the task force news conference from the previous morning and included the sketches and the FBI's profile. When George saw one of the sketches, the one given by Bonnie Spurrier, he couldn't believe his eyes. He knew he was looking at his son, Paul. But George didn't want to believe it. He read the FBI's profile and hoped to find something that disqualified his son from being the Specter. When he finished reading, he had found nothing. Everything in the description matched Paul, but George still wanted tangible proof. Like Ben and Ruth, George checked the company's credit card log for gas receipts. He also cross-checked the company's cell phone records with locations of the fires. All were a match. Dates and locations of phone calls and gas purchases made by Paul all coincided with the list of fires. George Keller knew there was only one thing he could do. That same day, January 28th, George went to the Everett Fire Department, which sent him to the Sno-King task force. George met with Wetzel and Litchfield and gave them everything he knew. George showed them all the credit card and phone records, and he explained his son's history of emotional issues, abusive behavior, and obsession with fire. A while back, Paul had asked his father if he could borrow the company's camera so he could take some pictures of his two favorite things: trains and fires. Paul had shown George some of the photos at the time, but George didn't think much about them. In recent weeks, Paul had stopped showing the photos to his father. As George thought about it now, he realized it seemed to have coincided with reports about the investigation into the arson fires. Like the task force in LA had done with serial arsonist John Orr, the task force in Seattle wanted to put Paul Keller under surveillance and catch him in the act of setting a fire. Unlike the task force in LA, which had to wait 8 months to make an arrest, the Seattle task force only had to wait 10 days. On January 28, 1993, the same day George Keller provided his information to the Sno-King task force, agents began to trail Paul Keller. They hoped they could catch Paul in the act of starting a fire, but each day passed with no suspicious activity. For those who were close to Paul, like his parents, they could see he was struggling. For whatever reason, he wasn't setting fires, but his emotional issues seemed to be growing worse. George and Margaret Keller began to fear that Paul might take his own life. On the evening of February 5th, those fears were exacerbated. During dinner, Paul told his parents that he was thinking about heading down to California to see a girl. To George and Margaret, that could mean anything: starting new fires in a different state, taking his own life, hurting someone else. Fearing the worst, George notified the task force and said they needed to grab his son as soon as possible. Around 6:30 the next morning, February 6th, Paul Keller heard a loud and forceful knock on the front door of his home in Linwood. When he opened the door, he was greeted by law enforcement. They asked him if he was Paul Kenneth Keller, born January 6, 1966. Paul didn't panic. He confirmed his identity, and agents placed him in handcuffs. During the drive to Sno-King Task Force headquarters, the police convoy blared their sirens, drawing attention to the fact that Keller had been arrested. It was a tactical move. According to the FBI profile, an arsonist often wants to feel important. By letting everyone know that a major arrest had been made, law enforcement hoped to feed into Keller's possible ego. But that wasn't their only tactic. The FBI also suggested that they surprise Keller with an authoritative figure in his life. Only one person fit the bill. So when Paul walked into the interrogation room, George Keller was waiting for him. George quickly took hold of his son, hugged him, and whispered in his ear, quote, "It's all over, son. They know what happened, so you have to tell the truth. Life as you knew it before this morning is over." When George left, interrogators began questioning Paul. Right away, Paul denied having anything to do with the fires. He was adamant that he had done nothing wrong and hoped that he would be going home soon. Again, interrogators knew that the best way to get Keller to confess was to appeal to his ego. About 15 minutes into the interrogation, investigators began complimenting Keller on his work. They said they were impressed at how prolific Keller had been in the last 6 months. They called him a master arsonist, and one said Keller was the best arsonist he had ever seen. The strategy paid off. Keller slowly began opening up and took credit for a few of the fires. And then, over the course of several hours, Keller admitted to more and gave specific details. As he confessed, Keller gave insight into his emotional state during his arson spree. He said when he began the fires, he didn't get any sort of pleasure from them. Instead, he felt sad and even bad about it. But he also blamed many of his actions on being under the influence of alcohol. He seemed to alternate between taking some responsibility and feeling guilty, and accepting no responsibility and saying he didn't want to go to jail. There was no way the task force was going to let him off the hook. In March, 1 month after his arrest, Paul Keller officially pleaded guilty to 32 counts of arson, but he admitted to setting 45 more fires. He was sentenced to 75 years in prison for the arson charges, and then came the murder charges. Investigators eventually tied Keller to the Four Freedoms retirement home fire, which killed 3 elderly women. In December 1993, he was formally charged with murder, and he received a 99-year sentence. Similar to John Orr's situation, the murder sentence would be served at the same time as the arson sentence. But it wouldn't really matter. Paul Keller won't be eligible for release until 2078, when he will be 112 years old. In subsequent interviews with journalists, Keller continued to blame other people or other factors for his crimes. In one interview, Keller alleged he was molested by a firefighter when he was about 12 years old, and he said that was why he became an arsonist. Whether or not the claim is true, it didn't explain why Keller started setting fires when he was 9. Paul Keller may never have shown actual remorse for his crimes, but his family did. George Keller publicly sought forgiveness for his son. For turning his son in, George was awarded $25,000. George donated all the money to Trinity Lutheran Church, one of the first churches Paul burned to the ground. Next time on Infamous America, we'll travel to the other side of the country to tell stories of 2 of the most infamous heists in Boston history: the Great Brinks robbery of 1950 and the art heist at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in 1990. That's next time on Infamous America. Members of our Black Barrel Plus program don't have to wait week to week for new episodes. They receive the entire season to binge all at once with no commercials, and they also receive exclusive bonus episodes. Sign up now through the link in the show notes or on our website, blackbarrelmedia.com. Memberships are just $5 per month. This episode was researched and written by Rhea Peroa and Joe Guerra. It was produced by Joe Guerra. Original music by Rob Valier. I'm Chris Wimmer. Thanks for listening.